Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Allison with Source Booksellers in Detroit, Michigan. And we are here tonight to celebrate and discuss Allow Me to Retort. The book was released at the very beginning of this month, and it's had a whirlwind in book sales that we're really excited about. And so if you're just, tuning in and you're not familiar with our bookstore, we're a nonfiction niche bookstore, Source Booksellers in Detroit, Michigan. And this book fits so well into our history and culture section. It's fantastic for conversation. And so I want to welcome Harold Pope and Elaine Mastad today to have a conversation about this book. A little bit about them both. Harold is a senior counsel at Dykema here in Detroit, so a law firm here in Detroit, where he lives with his family, and I must say, he has a lovely family. So he went to Concordia College in Minnesota, and then later to Duke University Law School. A fun fact is, and I don't hope you don't mind, if I say that you're a Lions fan, a Detroit Lions fan, a little bit, and a member of Phi Alpha fraternity. And so I'm sure maybe you've been able to encounter Mr. Mastad on MSNBC or Sirius Radio, but just a little bit about him. He's the justice correspondent for The Nation magazine, and that covers courts and the criminal justice system, politics. He's also an Alfred Nobler Fellow at the Type Media Center, and his first book is the Allow Me to Retort book that we're going to be discussing tonight. So welcome to the conversation, and enjoy.
Well, I guess, first of all, it's a pleasure to have you on. I have to let everybody know that my principal qualification for being here is that Allison and Janet are my wife's cousins. So that's my major qualification. But I guess the first thing I'd like to ask you is you have this great legal education and great intellect, but you decided not to be a practicing lawyer. So tell us why you decided not to be a practicing lawyer and why you wrote this book.
Indeed. First of all, thank you so much for doing this, Harold. Thank you so much to Source Booksellers. Hello, Detroit. What's up? My only connection to Michigan is my cousin, who's just a year younger than me, went to the University of Michigan. And since I went to a college that didn't have a real sports, D1 sports teams, I have adopted Michigan as my college rooting interest. But that's my only connection to the great state. Why did I decide not to become a practicing lawyer? Well, Harold, I tried. Because and this is not uncommon for a lot of African American students. My family had to sacrifice a lot to put me in the position to go to Harvard Law School, where I went. There were lots of people didn't go on spring break, and people didn't buy new clothes that year, and there was a lot of sacrifices so that I could go to that school, and I felt like I owed it to them to try to enjoy making money. So I tried. I went to my Wall Street firm and represented clients, and had a six-figure salary, and did that life for a couple of years. It wasn't for me. I found that it was difficult for me to make arguments for people and causes that I didn't believe in, which is not to say anything wrong with the lawyers who do that. That's the job. It's a service industry. Everybody deserves a competent defense, and I absolutely believe that. I just wasn't really good at doing that when I wasn't on their side. So my big quit moment is, I'm at this table, and it's, mainly more senior lawyers. I'm only in my second year, so it's mainly more senior lawyers, but I'm at the table representing, our client, and across the table is, the president, the attorney general of Nigeria, and a bunch of other people. And it was just, man, I'm on the wrong side of the table, right? Like, I'm just, because whatever the ancestors wanted, this was not it. This was not what they were thinking. I felt bad about what I was doing with my life, which is hard to sleep on. So I quit, really, I think almost 2 weeks after that. I quit very soon after that. And I started on the path that led me to write this book. So why did I write the book? Well, it depends on who I'm talking to. It really is. There are lots of different reasons that go into it. From a kind of 30,000 feet perspective, it's called A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution, not a guide to the Constitution for Black guys. And that's an important difference, right? Because one of the ways that the law has been taught to us, one of the, the ways that the Constitution has been taught to us, not only in law school, but in mainstream media and in, local colloquialisms, has been a decidedly white perspective, decidedly white male perspective, decidedly rich white male perspective. Those are the people who got to write it. And for the most part, those are the people who've got to argue about it. Those are the people who got to vote on it. Those are the people who've got to interpret it. And at no point, the people who look like me or you, Harold, or any woman in the audience get a say in how this document was written or interpreted or ratified or anything. So I really wanted to kind of talk about the document and talk about our legal structures from the perspective of a person that the Constitution was designed to ignore and enslave. It looks different from that perspective. And so that's a big reason why I wrote the book.
So some might say that your perspective supports critical race theory.
Some would. Some people who would be trying to help me sell my book even more, perhaps, would say that, and try to get it banned in Florida. Look, when I sat down to write it, I was not thinking critical race theory. And look, for all the talk about critical race theory is a legal discipline. It is a thing they teach in law school. It's a way to think about how our laws and structures that are seemingly race neutral are actually part of upholding white supremacy. And while I did not take a specific critical race theory class in law school, because for my year, there was like a seminar at like 9 o'clock in the morning, and like, who wanted to deal with that on a Friday? Right? Yeah. So while I did not take that specific class in law school, certainly the book and my thoughts about the law are informed by the ideas that this document, our legal structures, many of our laws and statutes and ordinances are designed to uphold white supremacy. The concept that sameness is the exact same thing as fairness is just wrong. It's something that certain white people really believe and really kind of go in for, but it's just not true. It's just wrong. It's very easy to have a law that is the same. For instance, it's the same whether you're black or white. If the law says that you can't marry somebody outside of your race, that's sameness. That's not fairness. It's not, and it shouldn't be thought to be constitutional or legal, right? So like you could say that's critical race theory, but that is the kind of exposure and experience that I'm trying to bring throughout all the Constitution. Look, this is a document, and I've said this a lot on this book tour. This is a document that was written by slavers, by white male slavers, white male colonists, and white male abolitionists who nonetheless were willing to make deals with slavers and colonists. Do you think they didn't know what they were doing? You know, their goal was to create a Western slave empire, and gosh darn it, they did. Structurally in the document, there are things that support and uphold white supremacy, even beyond the explicit things in the documents that devalued enslaved people, like the 3/5 clause, which most people know about. The 3/5 clause that counted enslaved Africans as only 3/5 of people for congressional representation. But people haven't always thought, well, why were they counted as 3/5 at all? Why count them at all? Well, because by counting them 3/5, you gave more power, more political power to their captors. It was white Southerners who wanted at least 3/5 counting of their slaves to make it look like they had more free people in their society and thus more representation in Congress. That's how sick that was. You know, people know that the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 was a terrible law that was passed that made it so that even if you could escape to freedom, they could catch you and bring you back to the South. They know that from 12 Years a Slave. A lot of people don't know that there's a fugitive slave clause in the original Constitution. The first Fugitive Slave Act was not the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. It was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. So what's up with that, right? So there, Harold, in that way, there are so many aspects of the Constitution that were quite explicitly trying to uphold white supremacy, and I tried to expose at least some of them in the book.
You know, another thing you talked about in the book was in dealing with the amendments. You say that if we looked at if we interpret everything basically using the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment, we could address a lot of the issues. Would you talk to the audience about that? For some of those who aren't constitutional scholars, like I'm not a constitutional scholar is what I was saying, but for some who are not even lawyers, could you talk about the First and 14th Amendments and then what you meant by that?
Yeah, so if you listen to Republicans, you think that the Constitution stops at the first 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights. And if you listen closely to Republicans, you think that the only amendments that matter are the first, which apparently allows them to say the N-word, and the second, which allows them to shoot people who they would call the N-word. That's the Republican kind of mindset on this. Well, to flip it around, if we're only going to need 2 amendments, if we're only going to really talk and deep dive into 2 amendments, the 2 that I pick are the 14th Amendment and the First Amendment, because I can basically run the rest of a fair and free and equal society with those 2 amendments. The 14th Amendment does a lot. If properly understood and empowered, the 14th Amendment says that there must be equal protection of laws. And that means essentially that racism can't exist, that sexism can't exist. There are a lot of the legal barriers that people face, whether it's in getting a job or getting a house or a number of other things, that just can't happen, right? It would mean that you can interpret, even though we have a whole different amendment, the 15th Amendment, that specifically addresses voting rights. And in fact, we have the 15th for Black people and 19th that addresses women's voting rights. You can make an argument, I don't need those 2 because the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment does all that work. White person can vote without restriction, and so can I. End of story, right? But then the 14th Amendment also contains the Due Process Clause. It says that you cannot be denied life, liberty, happiness, blah, 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 without due process of law. That means fairness, folks. That means the 14th Amendment has in its interpretation and definition the idea that laws not only need to be equal, but they need to be fairly applied to everybody. That whatever equal protection didn't cover, fairness surely covers. And if you don't like it, if you think something needs to change, if you don't like what I said, if you think somebody needs to stop talking about this nonsense, well, then we need the First Amendment, which says that you can say what you want, that you can practice religion peaceably in your own, in your own mind, in your own home, that nobody can stop you or what have you, and that the government can't tell you which religion that you have to use. It says the press can be free to print what they want. and that people can be free to say what they want. That's real. If you're trying to do a free society, I mean, that's fundamentally what you need. There's some other amendments in there I like. I think the 16th Amendment for some more taxation, I think that's pretty good. I think the Fourth Amendment is pretty good with no illegal searches or seizures. I think the Eighth Amendment is great. Too bad we don't use it, but like the idea that we shouldn't have cruel and unusual punishment, bravo, bravo. I wish that some people actually had modern developed senses of what cruel or unusual meant. But yeah, so there are lots of good ideas floating around the Constitution and its amendments, but the ones that you need to stick the landing on whether or not we're going to be a pluralistic society or not are in the 14th and the First Amendments.
I've got a number of questions, but you also talked
Sorry,
about,
I do that to people.
You also talked about abortion, the right to abortion, and how you argue that it should be grounded in the 14th Amendment. Why don't you talk to our audience about that as well?
Yeah, so here I have not just the 14th, I can also go for the 13th, so I'll do both. So
okay.
First, let's just understand how abortion is justified currently today, right? And we justify abortion through the right to privacy. The right to privacy is an unenumerated right, and that makes Republicans angry because it's not written down anywhere where it says you have the right to privacy. No matter, in the 9th Amendment, James Madison literally says that the amendments I'm writing down are not the only amendments because it's stupid to write a whole list. So there are more rights than Madison could possibly write down, and the right to privacy is one of them. So the right to an abortion flows from the right to privacy, that before fetal viability, a woman basically has a privacy right to do with her body what she wants to, which includes contraception, abortion, and also includes things that, are recently under attack, like the right to marry whoever you want, regardless of their sex or sex at birth. Right to privacy can cover a lot of things. Certainly it covers abortion, and that's fine. That's a fine argument for choice in reproductive rights. I think a stronger argument is the equal protection argument in the 14th Amendment, right? I think men have complete control over their reproductive system. The government does not decide when men can or cannot use their reproductive system and what it has to be used for. Same should apply to women. Unless you think, oh, but it's because she's having the baby and the baby has personhood rights. First of all, fetal personhood, not a thing. But even if you thought that it was at some point, name for me, please, the law where we don't allow a man to do something because how it's going to affect another person, how it's going to affect their unborn child. We don't, right? They will straight up, if you're an escaped a former rapist, if you've been released from prison after a rape conviction, they'll still give you Viagra. They don't care. No, you don't walk in. No man walks into doctor's office and asks for a masking cream for his herpes, and the doctor says, "Well, does your partner know?" No, they never ask the man that. They never ask the man anything. They just give him the medicine. And so equal protection says if you're going to do that for a man, then you're going to do that for a woman too. So if you don't like, so again, you can do it under privacy. You can do it under the 14th Amendment equal protection clause. But I also say you can defend abortion under the 13th Amendment because it says right there in the 13th Amendment, forced labor is no longer allowed in these United States. What so-called pro-life, I call them forced birth advocates. What they are doing are saying that they should be able to force a woman to gestate and birth a baby against her will for 9 months for no compensation. That is a point and click violation of the 13th Amendment. We do not say anymore that people have to work for some social benefit without choice and without pay. We simply don't do that anymore. So yeah, 9th Amendment, right to privacy, equal protection, 13th Amendment. There are lots of ways to defend abortion, but you have to have justices willing to defend abortion, and that's what we don't have.
So let's go to the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. Now, I can't remember which was it, Georgia, was it South Carolina, that they're now bringing back execution by firing squad.
Yep.
Now,
South Carolina's doing it. Utah's doing it as well.
Yeah.
Missouri has messed around with it. Look,
let me just ask, won't the proponents of this say that was the quote original intent or original understanding of the framers of the Constitution, and therefore, of course, is constitutional? What do you say?
Exactly, Harold. They will. In my book, I write that the Eighth Amendment is the clearest and easiest break point between originalists and everybody else. All right. When you really break it down, the Eighth Amendment says that prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. The Constitution does not define the word cruel, nor does it define the word unusual. In fact, the framers didn't even come up with that word themselves. That was a word they copy and pasted from the English Bill of Rights a century earlier than the American Constitution. So that is just a phrase that they just stuck in there, basically saying, we'll figure it out later. All right. That phrase is ambiguous by nature. So how do we understand what that phrase, cruel and unusual, should really mean? Well, the originalists, conservatives, will say we got to go back to the founding. We got to go back to the people who wrote it. We got to go back and think about the original public meaning of the words cruel and unusual in 18th century America. And they will look at documents and folios and, I don't know, woodcuts or whatever they can find to figure out what Thomas Jefferson thought was cruel and what James Madison thought was cruel and what George Washington thought was cruel. And they will come back to you after doing this, Ouija board analysis, and they will come back to you and say, clearly, whatever you think about cruel and unusual, clearly capital punishment was allowed because every one of those people engaged in some capital punishment. All the states had capital punishment as a possible punishment for a crime at the founding and before the Constitution and after the Constitution, meaning that no state thought that the Constitution's new amendment prohibited capital punishment, and thus capital punishment is not cruel and unusual as understood in the Constitution. And I will say to those people, you're right. I don't care. Why would I care? Why would I care for 1 second what these monstrous slavers and rapists thought were cruel and unusual punishments? These are people that didn't think it was cruel or unusual to keep Black people in bondage for centuries. They didn't think it was cruel and unusual to rape Black women, to sell pretty Black women at higher prices so they could be raped more. Didn't think it was cruel and unusual to split up Black families, selling some to the South, North, and some to the South. They didn't think it was cruel or unusual to brand slaves who tried to escape or mutilate them by cutting off their limbs for misbehavior. Didn't think it was cruel or unusual to stick firecrackers up the backsides of slaves who were misbehaving. And I'm supposed to ask them, are you making a joke? Are you having a laugh? No, I will not ask these people what they thought cruel or unusual punishments were. These people are moral monsters. I'll consult a comic book, all right? I will go to X-Men issue 2 and try to find what Magneto thought was cruel and unusual before I ask Thomas freaking Jefferson. Are you kidding me? So yeah, but that's the breakdown, right? If you believe in originalism, you believe that the moral ideas of these slavers still have relevance today. I don't believe that. I do not believe that we can learn anything about how a modern society should punish criminals or people suspected of crime. I do not believe we can learn anything about that from Thomas Jefferson or James Madison or George Washington. I just don't.
Are the originalists consistent? For instance, are they consistent when talking about the Second Amendment?
Yeah, no. So one of the fun things about originalism is that whenever they get stuck, whenever one of their ideas, whenever one of their current policy agenda doesn't comport with what they want, with what they think that the founding fathers said, they just make it up. They just make, again, their approach is to have a Ouija board as if the founding fathers talked to them and them only. And Harold, you're exactly right. I write about how you can see that very clearly in the Second Amendment debate, right? So the Second Amendment, right to bear arms, a well-regulated militia, thus being necessary to a free society, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. That's a pretty simple amendment, and pretty obviously on its face, it contemplates the militia, right? Like it's the second or third word in the damn amendment, right? A militia, a well-regulated militia is why we have some kind of right to bear arms. But the conservatives don't like that because we don't really use militias anymore. You know, National Guard, God bless them, but that's not really what the conservatives want anymore. So in 2008, Antonin Scalia and DC v. Heller invents, for the first time in American history, a right to bear arms based not on a well-regulated militia, but on the idea of personal self-defense. And he quotes a founding father. He quotes a argument that were made by what was called at that point Anti-Federalists. So there were the Federalists who were like in favor of the Constitution. Again, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist Papers and all those people, right? But then there were the Anti-Federalists who thought that the Constitution desperately needed amendments. And these were like people like Patrick Henry or George Mason, who then was at the founding was the governor of Virginia. George Mason gives a speech in Virginia talking about the Second Amendment. Mason and Patrick Henry were both giving speeches in the Virginia House of Delegates talking about the Second Amendment. And they say that the reason why they need a Second Amendment is because they need to make sure that their militias can be armed and trained. Why? For slave revolts. Because you see, it's pretty hard to hold people in bondage if you do not have numerical superiority and military superiority. Now, overall, the South had those things. The white Southerners were more numerous and more well-armed than the slaves in the South, right? But that wasn't true in every pocket of every state, right? So Virginia, which at one point, 40% of its population were enslaved Africans, right? There were parts of Virginia where white people didn't outnumber the slave population. There were parts of South Carolina where white people didn't outnumber the slaves. And so periodically, those slaves would revolt, as one does, ever yearning to break free. So the way to put down those revolts was the militia. The state would raise up their militia, the militia would come in, crush the slave revolts. Very Roman times, very Spartacus in that way, right? Well, at the founding, with the original Constitution, it wasn't at all clear that the states had the right to raise the militias. It was maybe a federal power, that it would be a federal militia, not a state-by-state militia. And Henry and Mason were worried about this. They said, and I'm quoting, that the North detests slavery and that you couldn't trust the North. If there was a Southern slave revolt, you couldn't trust the North to raise the militia and thus leave them defenseless against the slave revolts. That's why they wanted the Second Amendment, and that's why the Second Amendment is in the Constitution. Fast forward back to 2008. Scalia quotes the same debate, quotes the same speech, uses the word defenseless, but he's using it at that point in a completely different way. He does not tell you that the reason why they needed to be defended was to protect themselves against slave revolts. No. Scalia doesn't write that at all. He just writes about how even George Mason and Patrick Henry understood the need to be able to defend themselves. That's what conservatives do. That's what Republicans do. When they confront history they don't like, they lie and just make something else up so they can have their current political agenda, which in the DC versus Heller case was to liberalize gun laws even further.
You also spent some time talking about voting rights in the book, both the amendments that allowed Black people, not Chinese, of course, but Black people, and and then women to vote, and you discuss the Voting Rights Act. Why don't you just talk a little bit about voting rights and the issues surrounding voting rights here?
Yeah, so a big point of my book is to explain to people and show people that even the amendment process—
The light went out, by the way. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. That even the amendment process is broken and useless in the face of white supremacy, right? So that even, because a lot of people have said, even again during the story, like, oh, if you don't like the Constitution, the brilliance of the Constitution is that you can amend it. Let me tell you something about your amendment process, right? Aside from the fact that the amendment process itself is steeped in white supremacy, right? Like it has to be passed by the Senate, which gives votes to land and not people, and ratified by the state legislatures, which tend to be dominated by white males all throughout American history. Even when you get over those facts, the bottom line is that an amendment that the Supreme Court doesn't like, an amendment that the Supreme Court doesn't want to enforce, is really just a suggestion. And you can see it most obviously in the 15th Amendment and voting rights. Because again, after the Civil War, we have this whole amendment. We have Reconstruction amendments. We say 15th Amendment, the right to vote shall not be abridged on account of race, color, or creed. Boom, that seems like it should settle the issue. And what the Supreme Court did was take that amendment, put it in a drawer, and forget it existed for 100 years. Jim Crow should have been impossible with the 15th Amendment, but it was possible. It happened for real because white people, and white people on the Supreme Court especially, simply chose to ignore the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was ignored from the point it was ratified in 1870 until 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, by the way, is my pick for the most important piece of legislation in American history. It is the Voting Rights Act that made the 15th Amendment real, which means it was what gave voting rights to Black people. It is for Black men. It is the Voting Rights Act that made the 19th Amendment real and gave voting rights to Black women. The 19th Amendment didn't, the Universal Suffragette Amendment didn't allow Black women to vote. Come on. Black women were routinely excluded from the ballot box until 1965 and the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was so effective that in just about 40 years, you go from an oppressed people to electing the first Black president. That's a 40-year, from a flat-footed start. That's 40 years, boom, we're here, we're ready to go. Thank you for taking your foot off our necks. And what's the first thing the white people did? Before they even got Barack Obama out of office, as soon as Barack Obama won a second time, proving that it wasn't a fluke, what did white people do? They took away the 15th Amendment. John Roberts in 2013, in a case called Shelby County v. Holder, eviscerated the 15th Amendment by taking away the pre-clearance clause. That's where states, to change their voting rights, had to ask permission essentially from the federal government. John Roberts took that away, opening the floodgates on all of the kind of voter suppression that we're seeing today, but also all the voter suppression that we saw before 2016. And so one of the underreported reasons that Donald Trump won in 2016, it wasn't just aggrieved white people in diners in Ohio. It was the voter suppression unleashed by John Roberts in 2013 in Shelby County versus Holder. And that assault on the 15th Amendment has continued apace. In 2021, the most recent decision in Brnovich v. Arizona, they took away the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And again, that just now opens the field for all the kinds of gerrymandering that we're seeing at the back of the 2020 census. So again, one of the themes of the book is that white conservatives are not stupid. They know what they're doing. They have a plan. It's not an accident, okay? That's if there's one thing I want people to take away, the world looks the way it does because white people have chosen to make it look this way. It didn't just happen, all right? There are decisions, there are court cases, there are laws, there are statutes that make the world look like this. It doesn't have to look like this. You know, one really small way that I have for explaining how arbitrary it is the way white people decide to use voting rights. Look at the 26th Amendment, right? That's the amendment that lowers the voting age to 18, right? That's an amendment, kind of a Vietnam era amendment. You're sending boys off to war. You know, you're going to send them off to war, but they can't vote on the president that sends them off to war. That doesn't sound right. So you have the 26th Amendment lowers the age of voting to 18. All right. Well, that seems, again, is one of those things where it seems like it's clear on its face, right? But there's some ambiguity there. What happens if you turn 18 in the election year, but aren't 18 by the election, right? What if you're trying to vote in a primary that's in August and you don't turn 18 until September? What if you're trying to vote in a general election that's in November, but you don't turn 18 until December? Doesn't affect a lot of people, but it affects some people, right? How do you interpret that? Well, conservatives have said you have to turn 18 by election day. Not turn 18 within the year that the election is going, but you have to turn 18 by election day. Why? Why? Like, what does it matter? How is that a thing? But that's what they said. And so just a little bit along the edges, every year, there are a few thousand people who want to vote, who aren't allowed to vote because of a stupid conservative decision that makes no objective sense. Really small way, but that's how now ratchet that up to and understand that conservatives are always trying to find ways to keep Black people and minorities in general from the ballot box, and you start to understand why our world looks the way it does.
You also have some discussions not only about Scalia and his philosophy, but also about the Supreme Court in general. I know at the time of the book, Breyer hadn't resigned when you were writing the book, but he has now resigned. It looks like Judge Brown Jackson will get through the gauntlet.
Man, Harold, when I started writing the book, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was still alive. Woo!
Yeah. Well, why don't you talk? I know towards the end of the book, you start talking about the makeup of the Supreme Court and some ideas you have in relation to the lifetime appointment. So why don't you share some of that? I mean, let me just say that I'm not trying to have you say everything in the book so nobody will buy your book, but I thought maybe you'd like to talk about that as well.
It's no problem. And the arguments make a lot more sense when they're stitched together. And also in the book, there are a lot more curse words, if that's your thing. No, it's a lot of these arguments. I don't feel like I'm giving away the story because a lot of the arguments in the book are made in short form so that they can be easily deployed against Republicans in your life. So I don't think I'm giving away the story here. One of the themes, as I've said, is that not even a constitutional amendment can survive a conservative Supreme Court. So what do we do about the Supreme Court? And I am on team court expansion, court packing. I'm so for court packing, I don't even care when you call it court packing. I just want more justices. And not a little, like not the revenge. Like I've seen this, well, the Republicans messed around with Kavanaugh and Gorse and Merrick Garland, so they got 2, so we should get 2. Man, that's small potatoes. I want 20 because that is real reform. All right, let me start to tell you why. First of all, one of the pushbacks you get is, well, if Democrats expand the court, then Republicans will just expand the court right back. First of all, so how is that worse? Right now, the court is 6-3 conservative. If I make it 13-6 liberal, and then later conservatives make it 16-13 conservative again, what have I lost? I've lost nothing, right? So, like, who cares about Republicans coming back? But if you care about that kind of thing, me going plus 20 makes it a little bit harder for the Republicans to come back over the top, right? If I go plus 20, the Republicans got to come back plus 20. Like, you know, you give them an extra set of pause before they do that. So that's number one. Number two, one of the things that people need to understand is that our confirmation process is broken. As we saw with Ketanji Brown Jackson, the kind of ridiculous allegations against her, it's not about qualifications, it's all about politics, right? And you understand that when there are only 9 people. These people are going to have power for the next 30 or 40 years over your entire agenda. Yeah, it's time to go to the mattresses every time a seat comes open. You got 29 people, which is what we have on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Supreme Court is still powerful, but you've nerfed the power of every particular justice on it by a factor of 20, right? You're replacing them so often that it starts to become a little rote, a little less like go to the mattresses every time, right? Another huge reform advantage. Again, this works if you're liberal or conservatives, right? It's not a Democrat Republican thing. It's just a better government thing. Is that people want narrower decisions. People want mainstream decisions that don't change the law too much and don't go too crazy to one side or the other. Not me, I'm a crazy liberal. I want liberal decisions, but most people say they want mainstream decisions. Well, how do you think you're going to get mainstream decisions? By appointing mainstream judges? I don't even know what that is. Because a judge who is mainstream on one issue might be a complete loon on some other issue. You just don't know. The way you get mainstream opinions is to have more people involved in making those opinions, right? So you've got so one of the analogies I've used is if you have to get you and just 5 of your friends to go somewhere, as on the current Supreme Court with just 9 people, you only need 5 for a majority, man, you might end up in some places, right? Instead of you might end up at the club, right? You might end up at some, down an alley somewhere with you and your boys just doing something that you ain't supposed to be doing. If you have to make a decision that for 15 people to go out to dinner, as you would in a 29-person court, you're going to go to Applebee's, right? You're going to go to Chili's. It's going to be fine. Like, you're going to do some anodyne, mainstream, bland thing because herding cats is hard. Similarly, on the Supreme Court, the law is complicated. People are complicated. The issues are complicated. Trying to get 15 people to agree on anything is difficult. And to get majorities on a 29-person court, even if it's a court that's very slanted, liberal or conservative, to get real majorities, those decisions are going to be fundamentally much more narrow and much more mainstream just by dint of having to get more people on board. So there are great reform reasons for expanding the number of justices on the Supreme Court, to say nothing of the revenge reasons, right? So the revenge reason is that if I am so confident that having more justices would be better for the court, that I'd be willing to split them with the Republicans. All right, let's split them 11-9. If I'm going to get 20 more, let's split them 11-9. Can't be 10-10 because that triflingness that you did with Garland and Gorsuch, that can't be ignored. So we're going to get that one back. But other than that, 11-9, let's go. That's fair. You would still, where the court, if you put 11-9 right now, the conservatives would still have a 17 to a 17. Sorry, it would still have a 15-14 majority if you did 11-9 run right now, right? So if conservatives want to give me votes for my court expansion, 11-9, let's split them and let's have a bipartisan commission appoint the judges. If Republicans don't want to give me votes, if they want to obstruct, then I'm going to appoint 20 of my fierest, breathingest dragon liberals that I can find and see if Republicans can stop me. So, look, I like other reforms too. I like term limits. Term limits, you need a constitutional amendment. Sorry. And that's just harder than court packing, right? I like ethics reform. Ethics is desperately needed on the Supreme Court. Just look at the Ginny Thomas situation. We need actual ethical rules to apply to the Supreme Court. But that's not going to change the outcomes. That's going to change how they go about producing the outcomes. You want to change the outcomes, you got to expand the court.
All right, I got to say 2 things. First thing is, These are Mr. Mistow's opinions because
Yeah.
Harold Pope is on the ABA Federal Judiciary Committee. So, so at some
100%,
point,
sir.
yeah. So at some
Respect.
point,
Although,
I
let's
don't want
remember,
somebody saying Harold Pope put all this stuff out there when they're questioning our committee on how we rated the nominee. The other thing I've got to say is I didn't get any questions. I'm telling this to source. So if Allison wants to come back on and ask the questions, they didn't come to me. You gotta take yourself off mute though.
Okay. This was such a fun conversation. I do have a few that got emailed to me. And so here's one. Your book is especially timely. How can we as citizens help to make these ideas more part of our current policies?
yeah, well, I mean, look, you got to call your senator. First of all, on the solutions directly, you have to call your senators. I've been saying, if you live in North Carolina, during the confirmation hearings, right? You live in North Carolina, call Tom Tillis. I mean, we probably won't get his vote, but call Tom Tillis every day, because that can make politicians listen to their answering machine. They don't read tweets. They're not on TikTok, but politicians listen to their answering machines. And so, like, using that direct action to call your senators is important. But the other big way that I and again, part of the reason why I wrote the book is that people just need to be informed. It's a law, sure, it's a law book. I can't get away from that, right? But I tried to write it in simple language, not dumbing it down. Dumbing it down doesn't hurt anybody, doesn't help anybody, and people are smart. So I don't dumb anything down, but I try to write it without the jargon, right? Without the highfalutin, veil behind some of these concepts, because I believe that most smart people, most literate people can understand these concepts. And if they did understand what Republicans were trying to do and how Republicans are trying to take away their rights, they would care as much as I do. In fact, I know they would, because I see it on the other side. Republicans have done such an amazing job of telling their base how important the Supreme Court is, right? Their base isn't any smarter than the liberal base. But you can go to a tabernacle in Utah and you can find some person who's just like, well, I have to have the Supreme Court because of abortion. Doesn't know anything about civics, doesn't know how a bill becomes a law, just knows that she needs the Supreme Court, right? You go to a bar in Florida, well, I got to have that Supreme Court to keep my guns. They don't know, but they know to say that, right? Whereas liberals, progressives, we think that we got to elect a president. We think that we got to, the things that we think will help aren't always about the Supreme Court. We're not single issue voters on the Supreme Court, and we should be, because Republicans are, and that's how they win the Supreme Court, and that's how they get through their most offensive laws, is because they control the courts. So I honestly believe if you read the book and you understand what they're doing, you're going to be angry, you're going to be passionate about it, you're going to be knowledgeable about it, and that is going to inform how you vote and how you encourage other people to vote and how you encourage your senators to vote.
So I have a comment. Your knowledge and energy around the Constitution is refreshing.
Thank you.
How can the public gain more and more clarity and empathy for the benefits of a better interpretation? I think maybe reading your book. I mean, I'm answering the question that's being asked, but
reading is always reading my book, especially now. That's always good to read and be more informed. But there's also there's lots of legal information out there that is being put out by great people, especially women, and I want to really make a point of that, because I think often the legal bar, people get to talk about law. It's a very male-dominated profession. Even though there are tons of women in the profession, the talking head part of the profession tends to be very male-dominated, right? But there are women who are out there doing great work and putting out great publications and podcasts about this stuff. I personally listen a lot to Strict Scrutiny. That's 3 women. Professor Melissa Murray, a Black woman from the University of New York University, Leah Littman and Kate Shaw. Leah Littman is from Michigan, I should say, because we're here. Leah Littman from the University of Michigan and Kate Shaw from Cardozo University. 3 women do great stuff and kind of put it in, put it where the goats can get it. Like put it where most people can understand what's going on. Listen to them all the time. Rewire's podcasts that's specifically focused on reproductive rights by Amani Gandhi, angry Black lady on Twitter, and Hegemony. These are great shows, and they're always on the ball as well, which is super important because things are coming out. Put like this: you turn on your cable TV, and you will see every time the president burps. Right? They'll have a reporter on the right. President Biden and his dog barked at him, and it was very, they'll have that reporter, right? Congress, every day you'll have a report from Congress on your news. The Supreme Court, the federal courts are a co-equal branch of government, and they also do things every day. Every day. But those things are not covered on the cable news. So yeah, you do have to go out and search for this information a little bit more directly because it's not being fed to you on the TV, but it's out there, right? There are these podcasts out there, SCOTUS blog, there are lots of different places where you can get the information about what the other co-equal branch of government is doing.
Awesome. Harold, do you have your book with you?
Yeah, but it's so dark.
Oh, okay.
All right, it's got mine.
Yeah, I was trying to get this lamp fixed, so I'm sorry.
No worry, I love it.
You did that on TV tonight. I saw you.
I love it. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and thank you for the very rich and informative conversation. And our call to action is that we have the book at Source Booksellers in store and online at sourcebooksellers.com. And we've sold all of our copies, but we're getting more.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, Harold. Thank you so much for mentioning. I really appreciate it.
It was a very entertaining book. It didn't take. I read half of it going to on a 2-hour flight, and I read the last half today. It's pretty quick, so and interesting.
Thank you very much.